We have a very limited chance of keeping within 1.5 degrees. That terrifies me. I've spoken to the top climate scientists in the world, and they're terrified too.
Absolutely.
And if we're all terrified, then nothing happens. I think we have to regain a sense of what people power really means.
Is anything happening anyway? What you're saying is that where we are now with development, with consumption, with all of the freedoms that we do have, is worth it.
Maybe it's because I'm slightly older, on the brink of 30
okay,
now.
so now we're going to go into ageism.
No,
okay.
I'm Adenuga, and this is Off the Table, where we supercharge the debate about the issues defining our lives that matter to everyone but seem to be dividing us like never before. So we have brought together a group of smart, passionate individuals from a range of backgrounds to have no-nonsense discussions, and today we're asking if it's too late to save our planet as we take climate change off the table and into the hands of our passionate panelists. So guys, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. We are all here to talk about a very, very important topic that everybody should be discussing, climate change. I'm joined by Talia Woodin, who is an environmental activist, photographer and filmmaker. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm also here with Amy Bray, who founded the environmental education charity Another Way when she was 16 years old. Thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome.
And I'm here with Ella Whelan, who's a journalist and author. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Wonderful. I want to know, are extreme direct action protests doing the cause of climate change more harm than good? I'm going to come to you, if that's all right.
What do you mean by extreme?
I like that you threw it back to me. So,
I'm going to ask you the question.
When we see videos of people disrupting the lives of people going to work, commuters and things like that, when we see roads being closed, people not being able to travel and get on with their day-to-day, would you say that those protests become harmful to the general public?
I think in the UK, you know, the fact that like we don't already have disruption to our day-to-day lives because of the climate crisis, like puts us at a great privilege. And I think we need to like keep that in perspective, you know? The fact that it's been an issue for so long and there's been people trying to engage the general public, trying to engage people in power for so long through so many different means, and it's been completely unsuccessful. You know, we're plummeting towards a really, really scary future, never mind future presence for a lot of people. I grew up raised by people who spent years and years and years doing things within the system, doing things outside of the system, and nothing changed. You know, we're still where we are. We're still going down a really, really scary path. And the government isn't listening. They're really not listening. And so I think it's like, it comes down to how do we bring about that change? You know, how can we have our voices heard?
Ella, do you feel the same when you see protesters being dragged off of the streets by motorists and commuters who are annoyed that they can't get to work? Do you feel like they're justified in doing that?
Yeah, I stand in solidarity with the Canning Town Massive who pulled people off the DLR during the pandemic when Extinction Rebellion protesters were trying to stop people from getting to work. I defend their right to be idiots on the road. But if you look at the message behind these climate strikers, or you know, whatever they call them, it's a very undemocratic message. So it kind of sticks in your craw having to defend their right to democratic dissent. I think it's a really big problem if young people are feeling traumatised by fear. Because that's not a powerful position to be in politics. And I think a lot of this alarmism around, and I don't use that word lightly, I think a lot of the narrative from adults indulging in children's fear that the world is going to end, that the world is on fire, all these kind of slogans that are used, is a real problem, because the end point of that is, well, what do you do if you believe that the world is on fire and that the world is going to end? Well, you panic. And I mean, obviously, Greta Thunberg and other activists and commentators have suggested that actually we should panic, that it's a good thing to panic. And I understand that there's a frustration from a lack of movement of politicians in the past. But if you look at, for example, I'm absolutely no fan of the Conservative Party, but they've taken on the language of Extinction Rebellion, you know, officially deciding to no longer talk about climate change, but now use the term climate emergency. Okay, that's just words, and you know, politicians can fob you off with a bit of vocabulary here and there. But it'd be very hard-pressed to find any politician out there now that doesn't, you know, at least in some way agree that there should be quite drastic policies in place to change, to do something about climate change. I think we should be saying to giving young people a much more positive message, not just, as I said, to be kind of...
But can I just quickly interject? Do you think that's a lie? When adults are saying that the world...
I'd like to see you go to a child in Mozambique that's had their whole family, house, whole village destroyed, and say that, you know, those in power are indulging their fears and that they should be more positive.
So I thought we were primarily talking about, Extinction Rebellion and Western movements around climate change.
It's
and
not
the
the
global
climate movement is global.
If you take, for example, a child living in poverty in Mozambique, or indeed someone in Sierra Leone, or in anywhere in India, or places that are so-called developing countries, I think it is a privileged position for Western commentators and activists to suggest that arguing for plenty or arguing for wealth, for development in those countries is a bad thing. If we want to take seriously the issue of climate change, which I absolutely agree with my fellow speakers, we should, what you need to do is think, what is the solution to this? Is the solution freaking out another generation who, rightly or wrongly, might genuinely feel a sense of trauma and fear, although that I think is pretty perverse? Or do you say, right, what do we need? Really, I think it's a difficult point to make, but it's an important one.
But I do want to touch on that though.
Yeah,
is it perverse? Is it absolutely wild to say to someone, the world is not in a good place? There is going to be a flood very soon. There is going to be a fire. Some countries will not exist in a minute. Is it wrong to say that to someone?
It's wrong
because you're trying to protect them from being scared. Is that wrong?
It's not just a case of protecting people from being scared. It's a case of, if you give in to this alarmism, this panic, what happens is you start to view human beings as the problem on the planet. When in actual fact, this is
the IPCC report. The latest IPCC report is just terrifying, and I feel like that is not alarmism. That is science, and that is available for anyone to read.
Yeah.
And as young people, reading science that tells us we have a very limited chance of keeping within 1.5 degrees, that terrifies me, but it also empowers me to do something about that. I don't think we have to turn it into panic.
Yeah.
We can turn that fear into activism and into being empowered to do something about it and to stand out. I hope
many more people take a leaf out of your book, because I think that a lot of the time there is this desire to throw your hands up in the air and feel panicked. And this is the tricky point. The reason why that's a problem is because you end up having a very short-termist view of what to do with politics. Because yes, we can. This is kind of where people get tied up. There is the science, which is facts about what's happening in relation to global warming, what's happening in relation to climate change, where floods are happening, where all this stuff is happening. And then there's politics, and politics is meant to be about how you interpret facts and what you do with those facts.
Right.
What decision do you make? Do you say, ban all cars tomorrow, or do you say, change the cars we're driving? Do you say no one gets to fly anymore, or do you say how do we innovate a way in which people can still travel internationally, which is, I think, a good...
And you don't think that's happening?
I think it's not happening. I think more often than not now the narrative is human beings are a problem, we have to stop them doing things to the planet. So whether that's, saying that consumerism is bad, as it happens, as someone who's critical of capitalism, I'm not the biggest fan of consumerism.
Can I ask where you're
just
getting
let me
all
finish
of this information from?
It's this, this is
what you're engaging with, where you're getting these supposedly popular narratives.
I mean, if you look at, I think it's kind of, I agree with you, slightly cheap to focus on Extinction Rebellion, because yes, it's just one group. It's one group that, we've had Greenpeace and other movements that have been around for a very long time. It's not like climate change protesting has just dropped out of the sky today. But if you look at the narrative of those groups, it is very much that we should stop, halt all development, that we should stop doing things to the planet, that actually we are the problem. And I would spin it and say that human beings and human activity is the solution. So if you look at things like, we've got an energy crisis.
How?
If you let me finish the point.
Like how, though? But how?
As
I don't even understand.
Let's get to. I understand, but let's get to the end of that.
Maybe it's because I'm slightly older, on the brink of 30
okay,
now.
so now we're going to go into ageism.
No,
okay,
let's get to the end. Let me just get, because I want to hear the end.
It's not ageism, but I sometimes find it difficult to get into the heads of young people who do feel so frightened, and that's not because you get characterised as not caring about the climate if you don't show panic, and I think that's part of a problem with the debate. But if going back to the issue of solutions, it seems very interesting to me that very few people talk about nuclear energy. There's a real resistance, particularly within government, to look at the ways in which we could find different energy sources for a future.
We don't have time to invest in new technologies, build new nuclear power stations. We're talking about the next decade. We need to reduce our emissions drastically.
I think this is part of the problem. There are some things that we can do immediately, but you've also had, and this is where I agree with some of the climate protesters, we've had governments looking very narrowly, where's the next election? We're very kind of narrow scope, no long-term thinking. What are the things that we can do, this is a crucial point, that mean that people's quality of life increases and also we don't wreck the planet? I think that the balance there has been lost, and we've lost that first part, which is that it's a good thing that people travel more. It's a good thing that people have more. It's a good thing that
on what
working
basis?
class
Why
people.
Is that a good thing?
Because working class people take, for example, Greta Thunberg mentioned that it was really down on the Industrial Revolution in I think it was a comment or a speech or something that she made recently. She said, we've already proven that we're a terrible enactment on the planet because we had the Industrial Revolution, which was a terrible mistake or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Well, I mean, yes, there are a lot of downsides to the Industrial Revolution, but if you look about an event like that in history, which lifted people out of serfdom, which brought an end to, a feudal system, which was progress in society, which meant that, was the birth of democratic movements, of working class consciousness, all these things.
So you're basically saying that where we are now is worth it?
I'm saying that there is a lot to be celebrated about where we are now, that in particular...
And that's not, we're not arguing with that, but what you're saying is that where we are now with development, with consumption, with all of the freedoms that we do have, is worth it despite the climate crisis, despite the continuing legacy of colonialism and imperialism and all of those systems and that have brought about this crisis now, that haven't resulted in the freedoms and the enjoyments and the privileges for everyone.
I think, we have to remember that there are lots of people living in this country who, when you use the word privilege around them, they can't relate to that.
That's not what I asked.
But if we have this narrative that people are having too much, that they're consuming too much, I tell you, I know lots of people who wish they could consume a lot more. There's for lots of people, there is a lot of consumption that's to be left wanted.
We're not talking about those people. It's the richest 10% of the world's population that produces 50% of lifestyle-based emissions. It's those people that need to reduce their consumerism in order that the people in poverty can have what they need to survive and to have a better quality of life. But progress isn't just about having more and more, because that's not making people happier. We have a mental health crisis. We have a health crisis and inequality and poverty, and all these things can be solved if we start to live with more compassion and we share and we appreciate nature and not just in the name of progress consume more and more that the earth can't naturally renew.
I think I can definitely understand, because I feel like you are making about 3 different points within one.
It's tricky.
Within one space of time. But I just want to go back to what you were saying about when we're talking about the fear of young people, and you're talking about that doesn't mean that because they're scared. I don't know why we talk about young people as if we're not young. I don't know. I'm not going to ask you how old you are, but I'm 33 and I'm still very young.
Pushing 30, you start to...
I'm 33 and I'm very young. Anyone who knows me knows I do not act anywhere near an adult. So we are all young people within this space, definitely. And I think, so what I would like to ask you is, when we talk about the fear of young people, and the fact that now that's leading to everyone saying, let's stop driving, let's put an end, which I'm getting from you feel like that's way too extreme and that's putting a pressure on human beings having to stop their lives. Don't you feel like it's the government's job and the people who are in charge to see the fear in the next generation that are going to essentially run the country and actually cater to that? Because I think a lot of what Talia is saying, and Amy, is that it's not being catered to. So I can understand that you find that the extremist view of it and the way it feels like an alarm is not helpful. But at the same time, what are the voices of us as young people? How should we feel about the fact that we're not being listened to? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But
do you feel like we're being listened to? Do you feel like more things could be done so we don't have to be in a position where we have to say, actually, everyone throw your cars in the bin?
Well,
which can't be done. But
I think that if the government started catering to children's fear, that would be a bad thing. So I'm not saying that the government needs to
completely and, you know, forget everything else that they're working on ever. Young people are scared. What can we do to help them? I'm saying there needs to be some kind of movement, something that tells young people that actually we do care about your future. I don't think people would be sitting in the middle of the road if they felt like they were being listened to. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the government is listening? Do you feel like they're doing something?
Well, interestingly, if we take in recent Insulate Britain protests, I mean, there's lots of them are of an older generation, which is an interesting thing, that there are lots of old people who are involved in this movement. So it's not completely a young person's thing, although the school strikes has been, you know, one of the focus on points.
I'm going to ask you again. Do you feel like the government is doing something and listening to the young people?
I think that
not pandering to fear. Do you feel like they're doing something and listening?
I think the government wants to look like it is doing something.
And do you feel like they are doing something?
No, I don't think they're doing anything in relation to seriously taking on board the challenge of climate change, but also the challenge of how we're going to have sustainable energy source. And we've got a national energy crisis on, where gas bills are increasing by something like 400%. The government's not burying its head in the sand in relation to that. So I think they like to engage in a lot of empty words, but there's no real discussion about it.
And so, but the reason why I asked you that question specifically is because if they're not doing something, I think at that point there has to be some understanding that then people are going to do something themselves. And I think that's how we get here. That's how we get to extremists. That's how we get to people starting charities at the age of 16 rather than going outside and running around and playing football. I think that's what has to be understood. And it's not that I agree or disagree with extremists and the alarmist sentences you say that you hear. I think there just has to be that understanding from people that if you are saying, my house is on fire, and the person that's supposed to help you extinguish your house is not helping, you're going to do something else in that moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's where...
It's how we get children having the audacity to speak up to adults.
I think
this isn't just young people being scared. I've spoken to the top climate scientists in the world,
absolutely.
and they're terrified too.
Absolutely.
And if we're all terrified, then nothing happens. I think we have to regain a sense of what people power really means.
Is anything happening anyway?
And, you know, I want the government to do something. I want them to look at new energy sources, to look at how we can be sustainable, which, you know, we've lost the meaning of what the word sustainable means.
Maybe you have, like lots of people
Sustainable
haven't.
means a sense of future-orientated things. I think if we give into this kind of panic or roll our eyes when people bring up, you know, disagreements around how we're dealing with climate change, we'll never get anywhere. I think we've got to be a little bit less down on humanity as a force for good in the world.
Okay. Guys, thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you guys. Thank you for helping me take climate change off the table.